these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, folks. If you're a regular listener of this podcast, you might have heard me say in the past that I bemoan the fact that one of the greatest problems facing America is lack of critical thinking skills. It happens on all sides of politics. It happens in everyday life. And we have a guy here, a doctor, Dr. Todd Rose, who has written a book about this problem. It's called it's called Collective Illusions, Conformity, Complicity, and the Science of Why We Make Bad Decisions. So Dr. Todd Rose is the co-founder of the think tank Populism, author of several best-selling books on psychology of personal achievement. This is a really interesting book. So it sheds light on why we fall victim to social influences, how we misjudge the beliefs of others. Also explains the deep psychological underpinnings of the cultural breakdown of public trust and why so many people are being pressured into self-censorship. So Todd, thanks for being on.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, before we get into the book, tell us about Populism. So you just came down from Massachusetts today.
Yep.
You were formerly a professor at Harvard, right? And now you're here. So what is Populism? What did you do at Harvard? Why'd you leave Harvard?
Yeah. So at Harvard, I ran what's called the Mind, Brain, and Education program. And I was originally trained in neuroscience, but did a lot of work with my colleague who's here in what's called the science of individuality. So it's a lot of the methods behind like personalized medicine, personalized nutrition, getting away from aggregate data.
Yeah.
And what we found was that this focus on individuals rather than groups was not just important in science of like cancer treatment or keeping you healthy, but it showed up in everything from the kind of lives we want to live, right? Our aspirations, and we felt like it had bigger societal implications than just academia. Plus, I hated being in meetings all day.
Yeah.
So we left Harvard, my co-founder, Parisa Rahani, and we founded the think tank so we could just do what we want. It's been great.
Awesome. Okay, so that's the goal. Is it performance management, or what exactly are we talking about?
Here's in a nutshell, which is we think we've woefully underestimated what free society can accomplish, because we've adopted authoritarian, standardized approaches to things. Right? Yeah. If you think about something like education, it should worry us that our education system looks basically identical to China's. Like the goals are the same, the processes are the same,
really,
right?
In terms of what, like a K through 12 sort of standardized.
Just standardized.
Like you will do math classes, you will do social studies classes. Now China teaches different social studies, I think. But,
of course, right? Exactly. But the goals are the same, right? It's a batch processing. It's kind of the old industrial model. Once you realize that individuality really matters, right? Yeah. It's not something to ignore. It's really important to understanding people and getting the most out of them. You realize that has huge implications for how we think about the way our institutions are designed, the culture we have. We have to get away from this one-size-fits-all centralized system and back to where we trust individuals and empower them.
Well, and before we get into the details of kind of how we've forgotten how to think, if we ever knew in the first place, I'm not sure that the humans are any better than they were before. They're definitely not better, but I'm not sure we're any worse either. But when you were talking about that and kind of questioning these basic structures of a society, it does lead to the following question, which is how far is too far? How much do you burn the foundations down because how much do you throw the baby out with the bathwater in order to create something new? I mean, how do you know? How do we get to that point? Education systems are kind of an interesting...
Yeah, the good news is I would argue what we're asking for here is not stripping it to the studs, but actually going back to first principles, right? The basic rights and guarantees and aspirations vouchsafed in the Declaration and the things that we aspire to, I would argue that we traded those in then you have something like efficiency and like industrial production in the 1930s. And we've ended up with a society where we don't really care what your individuality is. We don't care what you care about. You show up, you drop your kid off at a school, they train them to be basically a really good average person. And then you go into a job, and it's like, the problem is whatever gains we got from that, we're experiencing almost pure downside now.
Yeah.
And
well, in education in particular, I mean, I can understand why we might not care what a 12-year-old thinks about what they think they should learn.
Sure.
But we should ask industry what they need, what kind of skills that they need, because that to me seems a big mismatch, and it's leading to this whole conversation about, should we really be sending everyone to college? Right. Is that how we should train them? And some people, yes. I think on the right, this conversation has gotten a little too far, where it's like you got a bunch of like famous, kind of right-wing college grads with like really fancy degrees.
Saying nobody else needs what I have.
Yeah, railing against college. It's like,
right.
Well, just hold the hell on just for a second here. But the conversation about skills training, vocational training, and just how much more efficient that is and how much more money you make. And look, you can always go back to college.
Well, I think here's the thing, which is we believe deeply that in a free society, institutions should be aligned with the values and priorities of the public, right? Since Frederick Taylor and scientific management in the 1930s, they flipped that relationship. So the system matters more. Yeah. And so we just plug in.
Yeah.
What we're after is transforming institutions so that they are aligned with and capable of staying aligned with the values of the public. And I think that not only does that help us cultivate, let's take education again. What we see in our private opinion research is that parents and the public want a greater focus on not just going to college, but preparing kids for meaningful careers to be able to think critically.
Life,
right? For life. It's like
we don't do shop or financial.
No, they can't balance a checkbook or whatever. It's like, it's crazy. And so, but what's interesting is that focus on even like critical thinking, the public wants that, but the system is not designed for that. That's not what it does. And so our argument is getting systems aligned to what people want will cultivate the things that the public wants.
How did some of us, though, get critical thinking skills?
I think we get it despite the system. I think
where does it come from? I mean, is it good teachers? Is it just teachers that were just...
Yeah, you can have great teacher, right? But think about like for me, just full disclosure. So I was a Harvard professor, but I also was a high school dropout with a 0.9 GPA. So in rural Utah before that. So, so when you realize
how that path,
right. But it's like when you realize that the system just blindly following what everybody else does is just spectacularly bad for me, and learning to learn to think critically, trust yourself, make good decisions, take responsibility was the only way out for me. And so for some of us, like that's how we got there. And others, I think you had good mentors and.
Yeah. And look, it keeps going back to this question, because I think at this point in America, we haven't really, just for the audience, like we haven't really talked about the book. Your book has nothing to do with education. But in ways it does. But we are at this point in America where everybody politically left and right is sort of questioning their institutions. Actually, like right before you got in here, I just finished a podcast with Douglas Murray talking about the attacks on Western civilization. So on the left, that's their thing; they'll attack Western civilization. But the right also has it especially recently, this sort of populist outrage against all institutions, and that tendency is there. Throw the baby out with the bathwater, and I don't see critical thinking in either one of those conversations, and that's a problem. There's talk of first principles. I don't see it.
No, what you see is, and this would get closer to the book, is our politics have become our identities. And when you get into that realm, this is the realm of my expertise, which is now we are willing to do and say things that we don't even really believe just because we believe our group wants it. And that's bad enough. When you conform, you give up your God-given ability to reason. It
explains a lot of polling numbers.
It really does, actually.
In a variety of questions. Look, and I tell people, it's like, you're not even, but you can't even really tell people that. I do, and I get in trouble. I don't give a but it happens a lot. It's like, and I'm like, that poll isn't real. People don't actually think that way. I know because I talk to them.
So you're onto it, which is, so at Populism, we do what's called private opinion research. So we have methods that get around the distorting effects of social pressure and other stuff and get at what people really think. And you're exactly right. I would argue that if you take everything that matters in society right now, I'd say it's a coin toss whether we're even wrong or right about what the group thinks. This is really dangerous. It's bad enough to blindly conform to a group when you're right about the group, right? It's still important to hold your own and make your own decisions. What this book is about is a whole different phenomenon where you're blindly conforming because you think the group wants it, but the group never wanted it to begin with. And so our actions of conformity make it true. And we're seeing this all across society, including in politics on both sides. Yeah. And it's become so self-destructive, and it's like self-inflicted.
Yeah. I mean, you definitely see it in politics, and since that's my world, that's obviously where I see it the most. I saw it. It would be harder to find examples in my time in the military because that's an interesting kind of case study, because it's life or death. And you might find examples like that in the military in peacetime, because we start to get real stupid when we no longer have like a life or death situation facing us. They start to get woke. They start to focus on things that just don't really matter. And so maybe you see an institution start to decay in that sense. But I always look back very fondly on my time there, because it was hyper rational. Yeah. And there was no space. There was some groupthink. Like it's hard, just like any institution, it becomes a good old boys club. It's hard to fire people sometimes. Yeah. But then again, the counter argument would be, you can name like 50 people who've been fired in a very small community just in the last year. So maybe it is working, but in politics, no, not at all. It becomes orthodoxy, becomes heresy. It feels very religious, and people on both sides have started to adopt a very religious approach to their politics, and I don't like it.
Yeah, it's not principled, right? And it's super dangerous. And it would be one thing. It's still bad if this is just where we were going. Mm-hmm. What I argue in the book is that actually most of it is not true, and it is because we are misreading our groups. We can talk about why that's true now, and not more so than before. Has a lot to do with social media, but we're misreading our groups, and our conformity instinct is actually leading ourselves and our groups astray.
What are some examples of this sort of believing something because the group told you to, or thinking that the group believes something they don't believe?
Well, let's go right after politics, and then we'll back off into some more enjoyable topics, because unfortunately, we could name 24 of them. But let's say on the left, and I was fortunate to talk to the president's people about this, as the majority of Democrats with the defund the police thing publicly said that they agreed with it. Yeah. Privately, that number was never higher than single digits. Yeah. But again, if we all think this, then I'm going to say it out loud, and I'm going to go with my group, and then it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy until you put it to a private vote, which they did. Then it goes down in flames. On the right, like I think you could probably guess the biggest collective illusion right now, which is the 2020 election. Yep. Right. Yep. Publicly, you'll see a majority of Republicans say, "Oh yeah, it was stolen." Mm-hmm. Privately, that number is closer to 14%.
Right. And as I tell people this all the time, I'm like, you have to ask them the second question, which is, what do you mean by stolen?
Yes, exactly. Because were there irregularities? Probably. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Everybody agrees that.
Yeah. Yep. When you push it to the point of, did it materially affect the outcome? Right. Yeah. Now, of course, because they believe that a majority of Republicans believe it. Mm-hmm. So Gallup calls them. They hate the media anyway. Right. And you're like,
they don't want to give in. Too.
No, I'm not giving in.
That's another like psychological aspect of it. It's like, I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear. I know what you want to hear.
Exactly.
Screw you.
And if I believe this is what my tribe thinks, am I going to sacrifice belonging to my group just to say something out loud to a media organization that I don't even respect? Right. Right. So, we could name a number of political issues where this is true.
And a lot of the influencer crowd falls into this constantly, right? Because like their job is to be an influencer. The problem is they don't really influence anybody. They just lick their finger, put it up to the wind, see which way it's blowing, and then are like, "Oh, I'm going to tap into that vein right now. I'm going to tap into this."
They're a force multiplier on other people's ideas.
I meet some of these folks behind closed doors. I'm like, "Wow, you are a very smart, rational person."
But that's
not who you are on Twitter or Instagram or whatever it is. And I'm just like, and some look behind closed doors are nasty, nasty people, but they're not my friends. Right. But I have friends who I'm like, I don't understand where you're coming from on that comment.
Yeah. It's funny. I have the same feeling with politicians, because as someone who's not a politician, the number of, I'll just stick with the right, the number of Republican senators and congresspeople who will privately tell me, no, of course, I know the election wasn't rigged, but I believe my constituents believe it. And so they don't say anything, right? Not realizing that the self-silence
is part of that. And I can forgive people for not wanting to stir the hornet's nest. Sure. Look, I've stirred the hornet's nest on this issue, so it's kind of over and done with. But it didn't affect my recent election. Nobody even cared about it, right? They honestly, because people are where they're at.
Because privately they didn't care. This is the thing.
Yeah, I mean, they care about things like, and you gotta zero in on what they care about. They want the elections to be secure. Yes. They want you to done. I was hitting that note like way before 2020.
Absolutely.
Like I feel like I was the only one. I was like, hey, hello. I've done like multiple podcasts on election integrity, proper reforms to election. No, doesn't matter. But. In the end, didn't affect it. But so I can understand when people just don't want to stir the hornet's nest. But it takes a whole new level of dishonesty to then perpetuate something you know isn't true, to affirm someone's beliefs, and that I would call that populism. Yeah. Right? And so that's I accuse the left of always being populist. It's always just telling you what you want to hear, always promising you something that you deserve that somebody else owes you. That's populism to me. And the recent upsurge on the right of populism, it mirrors the left, and that's what concerns me about it.
I mean, these are just two religions fighting against each other at this point. And what I worry the most about is, and why I wrote the book, is that I think these collective illusions may be the single biggest threat to free society right now that we're not talking about. Because again, it's one thing if we divide and we're fighting and we're polarized for real. That's still bad, right? We're not getting along. We're not compromising. But again, this is a whole different thing where we've become polarized around things that we don't privately disagree on. Yeah. But because we believe our groups think this, we have gone that direction. And we can talk about, like, we know with why this happens, and including why state actors like Russia and China have intentionally manipulated social media in order to advance these collective illusions. So and I can just say right off the bat, like, just as a proper definition, like, collective illusions are basically situations where a majority of people in a group go along with something they don't agree with, simply because they incorrectly think that most everybody else in the group agrees with it.
That's an important definition, because that's different from everyone just believes something, like, because that happens too. Yeah. But that's something else.
You have like full group think, right? Yeah. Where we actually agree. This is just literally the majority thinks something that the majority doesn't think, right? And so then as a result, and we can talk about it, like, because of our conformity bias as a species, we can end up going along with this just to get along, and it becomes self-fulfilling.
And so this obviously, it seems then intuitive that this gets worse in an atmosphere of social media. Because in the past, like, you have loud demagogues that are like, oh God, he seems very convincing, and he's said it so many times, and everybody else kind of is nodding their head. So okay, I guess that's right. But that's the past. And nowadays, it's like anybody with an account.
But that's it, right? Which is, we've known about collective illusions for about 100 years in research. We've known about them in culture much longer. Saying about the emperor's new clothes is a story of that, right? Nobody dares to say the emperor's not naked, right? And so for about 100 years, we've known about them, but it took the loud authority figure, really, right? To be like, I guess this is what we agree, because, but now
it couldn't spread as fast.
No, it really couldn't. They tend to be isolated to local communities. Nowadays, because of social media. So if we just step back and say, okay, how does this happen? So there's two things you got to know about, like, your brain for how we get collective illusions. One is, again, this conformity bias. Like, I would like to pretend I don't conform, but every one of us has literally built-in mechanisms to detect and try to stay with your group, right? Because it's smart, right? Like, we're not a lone wolf species.
Yeah. It seems like a proper evolutionary design.
Yeah, right. Like, and it's like, because, hey, I can learn through hard experience, or I can learn from your experience, right? Like, that seems like a smart thing to have, and we have those mechanisms. Great. And that conformity bias is so unbelievably hardwired. One of my favorite studies ever, mainly because I can't believe anyone got paid to do this. My colleague in the Netherlands, Klucherov, actually got paid. It was a really classy version of Hot or Not, which is like, put people in a scanner, you give them pictures of people's faces, and have them rate it on a scale of 1 to 5, how attractive they are, right? Only the trick was, which is, again, I can't believe he got paid for this, but like, you put them in a scanner and it's science instead of just creepy. But the trick was, so you rate something, let's say I'm in it, and I put a face and I say, oh, that's a 2. After each rating, a number would flash up showing me what the average score of everybody who had done the task before. Right. It was all made up, so we could manipulate like this. So half the time it pretended that the group agreed with you. Half the time the group didn't agree with you. On the trials where the group is aligned with you, it literally triggered a dopamine reward response in the brain. The same thing that hard drugs hit.
Interesting.
We are addicted to being with our groups.
And if you dive into somebody, and you like, so you show them these results and you're like, why are you this way? What do they say? I mean, because I can think of a couple reasons. One, it feels good to be part of the group. Okay. That's clearly true. But is it also true that there's this belief, because in a complex society, it's hard to know what all the facts are. So if you see a lot, this is where the influencers come in, right?
This many people can't be wrong.
I kind of like this person and they're saying this. So if I got to take my kids to karate practice. Like I don't have time to do my research. So I'll just go with that. Yep.
So you defer to authority. You defer to people who are famous, because people paying attention to you must mean something. Or we defer to the crowd. Right? The wisdom of the crowd, so to speak, which turns out from the book is not always really the case. No. But nevertheless, we are, rewarded when we are with the group. On the trials in that same study, where we tell you your opinion on who you think is good looking deviates from the average of a group you don't actually care about, which was crazy. Yeah. It triggers an error signal in your brain, which is literally activates areas of the brain that process physical pain. Mm-hmm. So we have every biological incentive to be with our groups. It doesn't mean we always will, right? We'll stand our ground. Okay. For how important conformity is to us as a species, we are spectacularly bad at estimating group consensus, because you've got through evolution a really interesting shortcut for how you guess it. Because you can't spend the time. Your brain can't be like, let's just count everybody up and then average it out, and that's the group, right? Yeah. Here's the shortcut, and you can start to see the problem. The loudest voices repeated the most are assumed by your brain to represent the majority. Look, back in the day when you had small towns like 100 people, that was probably not a bad shortcut, right? Now you flash forward, you think about on social media. So if you just look at Twitter alone, 80% of all content is created by 10% of the users. Yep. And according to Pew Research, those 10% are not remotely representative of the American public. Right. It's a very different kind of person that's always on Twitter. Yeah, and their views tend to be more extreme on almost every social issue. Yeah. But now here you can see the problem. If only 10% of people hold an opinion, but you think it's 80%, you're going to act a certain way. Yeah, then now all of a sudden this conformity bias will kick in. Some of us will resist it, but if you don't really want to pay the price of going against what you think your group thinks, you'll just say nothing, right? Or you'll lie about what you think, what Tim Curran calls preference falsification, which is really bad. If enough of us do that, then the fringe voice is the only voice anybody hears. The result's a collective illusion. This is why what terrifies me right now is, according to Cato, and we've got our own data on this that replicates it, about 2/3 of the American public admit to self-silencing right now. Yeah. And everybody reads that. I know what study you're talking about. It was maybe last year it came out. We all shared it. And I think a lot of people believe that that's solely referring to the problem of woke universities and all that. And that's definitely a problem. Yeah. But I don't think that's what they're getting at. I think you're broadening the aperture a little bit here, which is it's all groups. Yeah. It's all of you. And I tell the right all the time, like, you're doing cancel culture. You can't rail against cancel culture over here and then like live by this weird religious orthodoxy over here. And like, again, over things that it's almost like you're just looking for a fight. Like the what's tyranny the point? Of small differences. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it's like, and then you find the Ukraine, you go, oh, we have real problems, right? And it's like, we're over here like literally tearing each other apart. Even there, they try to find divisions. It's like, we can't even all just support Ukraine. It's funny. I had, to your point about this is, Noam Chomsky, who nobody would think is center right, would tell me, he's like, listen, I've been trying to be canceled for the last 30 years since Vietnam, right? Yeah. It's like, it's flipped and we're all doing it to each other. And now a kid in their parents' basement can actually can trigger this kind of collective illusion. And I was saying, one of the things that has driven me crazy about the way we've talked about state-sponsored interventions into social media, Russia, they interfered in the election. They say, they spread lies. Not really. That's not what they did. What they did, and what China does on steroids, is they have all these social bots that go in and they analyze conservative Twitter, liberal Twitter, and they find honest to goodness American sentiment, right? But it's fringe. Yeah. And then they swarm with these bots, retweet the hell out of it. Get it more engagement. And so it starts to feel like, wait, So
the biolab conspiracy in Ukraine that was an American-led Twitter conspiracy that the Russians were like, oh, good idea. We should say that.
You just pile
on.
Oh,
yeah. I think those Ukrainians, they were definitely building weapons in those biolabs, and the U.S. helped them, and everyone's like, see.
Exactly.
And it's like, guys, just you can Google this for like 5 seconds.
Yeah. And what's funny
really
is
going on here.
Like, as I was interviewing with Megyn Kelly, and I was sharing this, and she said, well, yeah, of course they do it. When I interviewed Putin, they were so proud. She's like, his top guy said, let me show you something. They took her to the place and said, watch what we can do. And literally, she watched them get into this and actually move sentiment on social media. So now you can imagine if you basically, and not surprisingly, on the right and left, a lot of the fringe views were culture issues rather than like principled.
Nobody wants to have a serious debate about healthcare. It's boring. They want to talk about,
and so
whatever lightning rod.
But imagine now if I can move the needle and make you think as a Republican or a conservative, oh, wow, look, my group, I'm out of step with my group. Mm-hmm. And they're doing the same thing with the left, but you're like, well, I'm not those crazy people.
Yeah.
And so now I'm faced with, I'm a person without a tribe, or I just give in a little bit and inch over here. Right. And as we keep becoming more and more polarized, again, it'd be one thing if we really did privately disagree. But what's shocking, we have more private opinion data than probably anybody in the country right now on the American public. And I can tell you, like, it's pretty shocking what we have in common across demographics, and what's holding us back in a lot of ways is actually these collective illusions. That's both the bad and the good news.
Yeah, I would say there's some good news lining that. It's kind of crazy to me that Russia is so confident in its ability to create division. They know there's nothing we can do about it, so they just admit it. Like, of course we do it. Who cares? What are you going to do about it? Because the answer is nothing. Because it's not. It doesn't. The more you tell people that what they're being told is wrong on social media, the more, at least from an authority figure, especially as a politician, the more likely they are to say that's exactly what you would say if you're trying to trick me. And there's like this is maybe one thing I want to ask you about, because it's a trend that I've noticed, which is, it's certainly a minority. And I'm one of those people who, and we kind of have to do this, like this sort of repetitive reminder amongst our staff and family, which is Twitter is not real life. It is not real, because people will be like, well, we're getting blown up with calls about this issue today. And I always ask, what does that mean? Don't tell me that. Tell me how many calls. Right. Because if it's 10,000, well, that's pretty significant. But it's usually like 50. Yeah. And like, what does that mean exactly?
Well, what's interesting is, so intellectually, it's just a certain number of people, but it feels like the whole world's coming down on you, right? And
and that's especially in a place of being a public figure, like it's 100 people are like, love it, just great, and then there's one or two that are like, we hate you, right? And that sticks with you. Like, it's human nature, and it's interesting. It's like people intuitively understand what you're saying, because you see this online quite a bit, and like, again, in politics, political commentary online, or just flooding the comments. They'll always say something like, "We are the people, and you need to listen to us." Yeah. And I'm always like, "You're not. You are you. You are. Like whatever Ryan 254. Like that's you. I mean, it is apparent to me that that's not everyone."
No. But they're literally, like, this is the whole game, right? Everyone from Ryan 252, whatever, to every president of the United States has tried to speak for the people. Because if you can convince the people that you are speaking for the people, then you can move the needle, right? And you can generate these collective illusions. You can get conformity to become weaponized, and you can get your way. And like, if you genuinely have a fringe view, this is your only path to power. Is to actually convince people that you are in fact the majority and get them to do the work for you.
And they've gotten quite adept at it. I'm not sure if they know they're doing it consciously or unconsciously, but it's certainly happening. And it's, what I was going to ask you about, your take on is the observation I have that there's, again, it's still small. I went off on a tangent there talking about small versus what the majority think, but there's a small number of people who seriously believe that the truth can only be found in the deepest, darkest corners of the internet, and are like, if you don't find it on patriotstateusa.com, then like, that's where you find the truth, because everybody else is lying to you, and it kind of gets to this loss of trust in institutions. I don't even know how do we get there? Well, how do we get out of it?
We have a sense for how we got here and how we get out of it. At least a good hypothesis, I think, which is, so a couple of things. One, in some ways, the internet was a guaranteed in the first wave of it to break the authority like for a long time, a couple of news outlets, and if a high-ranking politician said something, you really didn't have any other way to question it, right? Mm-hmm. So if Kennedy tells you this is what happened in Cuba, what could you do, right? Like, so the democratizing of people's ability to communicate with each other was guaranteed to have us lose a little bit of trust in authority, because they got so used to the fact that, like, because we say so.
Because you'll find a contradiction, and you find one contradiction, and people are kind of wired to say,
run with it.
Got you. Right. Everything you say is wrong now. And it's like, how do we get to the critical thinking skills to say, no, what they said is wrong here. It doesn't mean everything that happens from this point on. You have to assess each thing individually.
And here's the problem, which is that when you think about what's happened, particularly coming out of COVID, almost all of our data points to one big trend, which is the end of compliance culture. Mm-hmm. Like, people just are fed up with being told what to do. And look, that's healthy if you can make it constructive, but it can also be
generally good for being a Republican too.
Yes,
it's kind of what we're going for.
Good. Yeah, back in the day, right? Hopefully we get this back again.
Yeah, we're trying to stay on that route,
right? Yeah. But so it could lead back to this revival of sort of self-determination and kind of bottom-up approaches, or it leads to rank populism, right? Where it's just burn the whole thing down. Yeah, okay, I'm no longer follow the leader, but I'll just follow the tribe. And so for me, the thing that I'm the most worried about is, it's funny when we talk about trust, there's actually a few different kinds of trust, and elites want you to trust institutions and trust elites. Mm-hmm. But in truth, I don't need to trust either of those. Yeah. The government should be accountable to me. Right. I don't need to, it's weird. Why do I need to trust the government? Mm-hmm. I know that sounds like, no, just verify, right? What we need to do is trust each other. And if we don't trust each other, the whole experiment is over, right? Because if you think about it, then that's called social trust, which is trusting strangers, and not like with your baby, right? But basically, do I think most people are capable of making decisions about their own life, right? And it sounds kind of simple, but that question is very predictive of how functioning a free society is, right? Because there's really only two ways we can interact with each other. I can trust you to make decisions because I don't think it'll hurt me, or at best it might benefit me, or I'll have to control you, right? I got to make the choices for you. If I think your choices will hurt me, I'm not going to let you make the choices. Yeah. And so what we've got is this end of compliance culture, but unbelievably low levels of social trust in America.
It's a bad combination.
Yeah. And so a lot of what we do at Populism on the culture side is understand the levers that can actually move the needle to get social trust back, so that this shift away from compliance can lead to self-determination, where we genuinely are betting on each other and cultivating each other, allowing each other to make their best contribution. Otherwise, this is going to be really bad.
Yeah. And the other observation I have is there's definitely a large group of people that like to be contrarians for the sake of being contrarians.
Which, by the way, they're the most predictable people on the planet.
Right. It's like, you're going to be against this, against this. I mean, where that really reared its ugly head to me was the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where I'm like, look, I understand there's a lot of foreign policy issues that are maybe gray area. Not exactly sure who the good guys and bad guys are. I mean, we're not sure that our decisions were the right ones. But this isn't one of them. This is so black and white.
You don't get very many good versus evil moments, right?
No, it's so easy, right? Yeah. This is the first real. Well, I think Soviet Union was clearly bad, but Hitler was clearly bad. There's a few, I guess, but it's
been a while.
But it's been a while, yeah. In modern history, it's been much more gray area. And there is a collective understanding that China is an adversary and doesn't have our best interests in mind. Everybody's sort of coming around to that. That's good news, I suppose. And I think it's based in logic and fact and critical thinking and data and history. So that's all good. I guess we're doing okay there. We should have some reason for optimism. But this on the right is what I'm talking about.
Unbelievable.
On the kind of apologies for Putin. It's, again, very small. And they think, but they love acting real big.
It's a vocal minority,
and they've done a good job in getting people to And I don't even know where I don't know where they're coming from on this stuff. Except and I think a part of the two things. One, contrarian for the sake of contrarianism, which is just fun for some people, especially people who live their lives online, which is mostly where this opinion lives. Because I talk to normal people about this, and they're like, "What? What are you? Nobody's saying that." I'm like, "No, trust me. Just look. You gotta pay attention." There's a couple members of Congress whose comments are replayed by Russian propaganda TV.
Isn't that unbelievable?
Yep. And that's not good. So it is something. It's very small, but it is something. And I think the other thing that maybe drives them is because this is the same group who's like the No More Endless Wars crowd, and who are just against all foreign policy, against all war. They remind me of liberal '60s professors.
Right.
They make the same arguments. Everything America's ever done is bad. It's all stupid. Why don't we just actually focus on home? Well, it's okay. You can't do both, and the world isn't interconnected. I mean, they just.
And there is such a thing as a just war, right?
So, and it's there is, and just interventions. I mean, you got to ask yourself, these are complicated questions, and to reduce them into this oversimplified nonsense is very frustrating. But it is what it is. I guess.
It's also the first step. Simplifying it to a binary thing is the first step to generating collective illusions, because pluralism is the best antidote to illusions, right?
Yeah.
If groups have competing ideas and we're up and debating them, I don't feel compelled to pick a side.
Yeah.
Right. If I can make it binary,
you have to pick a side.
Then you have to pick a side.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. Talking about the social distrust, why is it? You cite how Norwegians and the Finns think about their social trust, or how they score on social trust scales. Why? I don't. Why is it that their societies seem to trust each other more, and ours has declined over time?
So first of all, the decline. Let's talk about the decline first, and then what we do about it. Which is, on the one hand, you might think, well, maybe we're just in a special moment right now, and it just is kind of vacillating, and it'll kind of come back. Part of the blame for me rests with, and I brought this up earlier, Frederick Taylor, Scientific Management. We took basic free society principles of institutions serve people, right? I mean, that seems kind of obvious.
Yeah.
He flat out said in the early 30s, in the past, people were first. In the future, the system has to be first. He invented the whole idea of a shop, of management versus workers, of basically turn people into cogs in the name of efficiency. Now, we got a lot out of that, right? Industrially, but it was soul sucking, right? Yeah. And so think about, on the one hand, so every generation since the 1930s, every generation in America has had lower levels of social trust than the preceding generation. And in part, we know that in democracies, whether or not our institutions trust us is the best signal of whether we believe other people are trustworthy. If you think about it, if basically I look around and go, well, why can't parents have a say in where their kids go to school or what they're taught? Well, there must be a reason we don't really let parents have a say, right? And so we see this all the time, and it's the signals we get from our institutions. And I can tell you personally, I have one, I'll get on my hobby horse here, one institution that if I could dismantle completely is welfare. And not dismantle welfare, meaning I was on welfare, had 2 kids before I turned my life around. But we spend, food stamps has roughly 25, 27% overhead. Yeah. So we can make sure a single mom in El Paso doesn't buy the wrong soda. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? It's, so we were on food stamps, and the dignity stripping of I remember sitting in a checkout line, and my youngest son, who was 2.5, loved chunky peanut butter. Mm-hmm. And it was already embarrassing. I knew my dad had told me, if we took this, it's not a handout. I don't deserve it. It's an investment on the part of my fellow citizens. And if I take the money, I had an obligation to make that investment pay off. Mm-hmm. So I had the right mindset, I believe. Yeah. And yet here we are scanning stuff, and big long line.
This doesn't work. This works.
And the checkout person, it felt like she screamed it, but it might have been the PTSD for me but it goes beep, and she goes, "Sir, you can't buy chunky peanut butter with food stamps." Jeez. And I'm crawl in a hole. I never forgot it. And I just felt I won't say what I felt like, but on a nice clean podcast,
I think everybody kind of would feel like that.
And the thing is it's so what's interesting is when you look at, under collective illusions, again, we could name a couple of dozen that matter right now. For me, one of the biggest illusions of all in the US is about trust itself. Mm-hmm. So not only do the supermajority of people privately believe that they are trustworthy, right? We did what was the largest private opinion survey ever on what Americans view as a successful life, which is kind of interesting. Trade-off priorities for your life.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, I remember reading about that.
Yeah, it was so interesting. The number 3 most important priority, and you can't fake this, we can talk about the methods, but the number 3 trade-off priority for Americans was to be viewed as trustworthy. Okay, so yet when you ask them about what other people would say, they think other people don't care about being trustworthy and aren't trustworthy. So we've got this massive illusion around trust itself. Yeah. So it's like, so part of us at Populist is like, you got to socialize the idea. Like literally, like people don't even know, less than like 3 or 4% of the country really knows what a collective illusion is right now. So let's get that, like people at least understanding that this could be true, that your brain could be lying to you about the group and you're making it true. And then we're going after some of these core illusions, like the illusion of trust, which if you can solve for that, then we can make a lot of progress.
Well, if people just say it so casually now. You can't trust anybody. It's just, it becomes truth, right? Yeah. Politicians are all corrupt. I'm always like, what do you mean by that? Right. Really, what do you mean? Are we taking bags of money? Oh, you're making a bunch of money.
Because you're like, I don't know where show me where the line is. Because
and it's like, I'm just like what do you guys think is happening here? It's frustrating to no end, and these things have just been said at every political rally. Now, of course, every politician likes to affirm those beliefs because I'm going to go clean it up. Right. Because like, what else are you going to say? And it's just, it's frustrating to no end. And I always ask people, at least know why you believe what you, or why you're saying what you're saying. Know why you believe what you believe. You think we should all be booted out of office? You think term limits are the only answer? Okay, just know why. Yeah. Just know why. You think Texas is run pretty well? There's no term limits. Also, no contribution limits. So that's interesting. I mean, people don't even know just the basics.
What's great about that, I love that you brought this up, because in the book I talked about like one of the best ways to test whether you're about to succumb to a collective illusion is to ask the question why. Yeah. So it turns out like if we're all falling for the same copying of each other, and I ask you like, wait, so why did you pick this? And you say, because obviously it's the best. Like you don't even know, right? Mm-hmm. So it's almost a dead giveaway that this is just an illusion that we've all just fell into. But the good news is getting used to asking yourself why, like you just brought up, helps you maintain your own sense of like, how did I arrive at the views I hold, right? Mm-hmm. And make sure that the views you hold are the views that you privately actually arrived at, rather than just stumbled into because it's what your group told you to believe.
And God forbid you fact check any of it. I mean, like my in the last 6 months, I've been personally I suppose the victim of a collective illusion, because that's what all political smears are. Of
course.
Like it's saying something enough times and people are like, well, I mean, they said he's a rhinist globalist lizard, and he works for Klaus Schwab. I mean, they said it. Yeah, but is it true? I mean, it must be, because people say it. People say it. But why do they say it? I mean, because it must be true, but why is there any evidence of this? like, come on, man. Yeah. Like, because I want to move on. I want to move on to some serious discussions, like about what are we going to do about healthcare in this country? What are we going to do about the board? I want to move on to serious discussions. Yeah. And we seem to be in a very unserious time, but I want to go back to my question. Why do Norwegians have a higher level of social trust? Do we know?
So, people have studied that like crazy, trying to figure out, and some of it does have to do with the broader sense of taking care of one another, for sure. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean, what's interesting is it doesn't necessarily mean socialism, right? Mm-hmm. It means a belief that most people in my community have my back, right? Yeah. And there's a lot of ways we can provide that. The problem even in theirs, and something I wrote about, because the thing we care about in the US is we're one of the most diverse countries in the history of the world. Yeah. Right. So when people ask about social trust, if I say it really is, can most people be trusted? It's just a gut feeling you have. Mm-hmm. It's like a threshold.
Yeah. It's not your neighbors.
No,
right?
It's strangers.
Yeah.
It's not.
If you ask the question differently, you might get different answers.
Yeah. And what matters for free societies is your gut feeling about people you don't know. Yeah. Right. Because the other stuff is earned and it's important, but this social trust is just trust in strangers. What's interesting about Scandinavian countries is they have really high levels of it, right? Mm-hmm. Which is interesting and admirable, and we'd love to have that right now. But one of the things we care a lot about is it's not enough to just have a high level, it's who's included, right? And what you find in Scandinavian countries is, for example, they don't mean immigrants. So in their mind, when they say most people, they say,
so little immigration.
Yeah.
And they're 99% white people. So
right.
It's
so
a little bit of a different situation.
Yeah. And what we don't want is we need to understand how to move the needle on social trust that not only increases the level, but expands who's included in that, right? Yeah. Because otherwise all we have is, well, I trust my in-group and everyone else can go, But like, so for us, one of the most important things about collective illusions is like shared values are the moral foundation of all social trust. Yeah. So if I believe you and I share values, we don't know anything about each other. If we just knew that, I'm more likely to trust you. That makes sense.
And less likely to try and advocate for laws that control you.
Right.
And so the COVID mask debates and lockdown debates, this was like this problem on steroids worldwide. I mean, frankly, in America, I think we've dealt with it more sensibly.
In a weird way, right?
It's kind of crazy, but only because there's so many countries that have dealt with it so poorly. I mean, China right now is still locked down.
It's like, good luck with your zero COVID policy.
Yeah,
right?
That's insane. And so that's a whole other interesting conversation about, I think people have given China way too much credit as far as, look how efficient they are. They always make the perfect decision because it's, they're not dealing with political problems or political ramifications. And it's like, you make some really stupid decisions that way too.
Well, authoritarian regimes, you're seeing Putin right now cutting himself off from honest information about how the war is going.
Yeah, I don't want to hear about it.
Right. So it's like, no one's going to tell you the truth.
The Chinese do the same thing.
Of course. And it's like, and once you say you're all powerful and all knowing, you can't make any mistakes, right?
So is communism like one giant collective illusion?
Like, absolutely.
In fact, in the book, the extreme?
It's the extreme. Like in the book, I actually laid out what I think is the most interesting example of the way in which identifying an illusion and puncturing it can actually drive social change in a way that would seem unimaginable is the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, right? So if you think about it, it was the only time we've overthrown a communist regime in history without a single person losing their life.
Yeah.
In the 80s, I think about like not at the same time like Hungary and the bloody massacres there. Even Czechoslovakia earlier was violent, and that was actually led by what I think is fascinating is not a politician, not a military figure, but Václav Havel, who was a poet and a playwright. And what I love about it is I think everyone should read. He has a treaty called The Power of the Powerless, which is unbelievable and unbelievably timely to the moment we're living in. But he recognizes in that because he was a playwright and he was against communism, he was writing satire, but he had to write it so subtle that the authorities wouldn't recognize they were being made fun of, right? Yeah. And so
he wrote like the Babylon Bee.
Right, exactly, right. Although it's pretty funny.
No, it's
right?
great. I mean, but it's obvious.
It's obvious, right? So he writes a play called The Garden Party, which is just absurd, right? It comes out, and it is like a runaway success for 2 years. It is like the Hamilton of its time. And he sat and he watched almost every single night. And he said, people laughed at all the right parts. Like, you wouldn't laugh if you actually believed in communism.
Right.
And what he realizes is that they don't really believe, but they think everybody believes. So they're going along.
Yeah.
And what he figures out is you have to do two things to get the change. You have to create the conditions for people to reveal their own values to each other. And you got to show them a better way forward based on those values. He was mocked. I mean, it was like, he was not taken seriously. Like, you need to form a political party. You need to have international military support, whatever. He said, nope, it's about literally taking personal responsibility for your authenticity. That was his claim, right? They set up these ability for people to slowly reveal themselves in small ways. He had a neighbor, old woman, who had this small little garden plot. It wasn't even a garden. It was like a flower pot that she was in for garden stuff. And he said, you like gardening? She says, no, I don't. It's like, I can see your garden. That's not mine. It's like, it has to be. But it was like, you just learned under communism, you just don't say what you think. There's no good can come of that. And that they don't need you to really believe, they just need you to go along.
Yeah, we just need you to pretend to work.
Yes.
And we'll pretend to pay you. Right?
Exactly.
The famous saying.
But then everybody sees you going along and goes, well, he must believe, right?
Right.
And so it keeps pressure up. So what was so interesting is, as he starts to fracture those illusions, these small ways, it comes to a head pretty quickly. He did about 7 solid years of work, and then just a few months before it all comes down, all the protests, and then it's over in a couple of weeks, he's interviewed in an international magazine, and even he doesn't see it coming. He says, look, I'm I'm in this till the end, but I don't think I'll live to see the change, and that's okay.
Yeah.
3 months later, he was the first democratically elected president of a free Czechoslovakia.
Oh, wow.
And look, here's my thing. If a poet can overthrow communism, just think what we can do in this country.
Well, Elon bought Twitter today, so that was cool.
And by the way, if you're listening, Elon, as we've talked about before, his plan to get rid of social bots will do more to dismantle illusions and social media driving those than anything else.
I got to hear more about that because I thought they already tried. I guess they don't really try to stamp out.
And they don't really. Here's the thing: they don't really want to because it inflates the exactly. It inflates.
What's frustrating about that is they don't need to do it. Like if you remember the Wild West days of social media, there weren't really the algorithms, so you could get 1 million likes on something. But now they tone that down. It is fascinating too. I noticed I gained like 10,000 followers the moment Elon bought Twitter. Now, I don't think they changed the algorithms that quickly. I'm not really sure what the explanation is behind that. Maybe people were just like deciding like, you know what, I'm going to be back on Twitter now. Maybe, I don't know. I do think I was laughing. I almost tweeted this. I really wanted to. I think it's an acceptable thing to say on the podcast, but I'm going to be laughing at, there's going to be a lot of disgruntled people whose engagement doesn't change. And it's not changing because you weren't being censored. Your content just sucks.
Just sucks.
So I mean, I'm paving the way.
Oh, for sure,
that's going to happen.
You should say that. That's a great tweet because it is. Let's just put it out there because for sure,
truth makes people very upset. You know, because it hits real deep.
And as Elon said, right, if basically the things you're doing on social media make the fringe 10% on both sides mad, you're doing something right.
Yeah, and I guess that means I'm doing a lot right. But it has frustrated me over time where this is why politicians turn into the kind of people that you don't like, because the public punishes them for saying what they think or for speaking in nuance or for speaking about issues in that kind of pluralistic way that you talked about instead of this black and white way. Because people would say what I just said and be like, "Oh, okay, Dan. So I guess they were never censoring."
Right.
That's not what I said. Oh, it's not what I said. But that's clearly the path that you could talk about the elections being stolen. It's the exact. Oh, so you're saying there's no election fraud? Not what I said. Not what I said.
But there's exactly one emperor who benefits a lot for everybody believing that the only way you could lose is for the whole thing to be rigged.
Right.
Right.
And like both sides have done this
of course,
extraordinary degrees. It's bad. It's bad. They've got to stop. I wish the left wasn't so hypocritical on that. Anyway, I don't want to.
Well, you think about
it.
I'm there with you. But it's like you're going to be mad at people protesting the election count, but we did that before too.
You did it, just the last time.
Just the last time.
Yeah,
right?
We did it a little more extreme this time.
Yeah, right.
Actually, there's one question I wanted to ask you. About the mimes in Bogota, because I went to high school in Bogota.
Oh yeah.
From 98 to 2002. My dad was in the oil business, so we were living down there. I don't remember any mimes, but I mean, it's not that important.
You probably weren't driving at the time too.
No, but I wasn't, but I was in a car constantly. I mean, I was in the city, but granted,
are you saying I'm lying about the story?
Possibly. Well, I'm wondering what years they were, because I don't remember. I would have remembered the mimes and the clowns. Yeah. But
go on YouTube. There's some good videos of it. Yeah. It's pretty funny.
It could have been in the South. I mean, Bogota is a very large city, and I think a lot of social experimentation probably would have occurred in the southern part of the city, not so much in the northern part of the city. In any case, that's not really the important part. The important part is what did it teach people? There's a similar thing that happened in Spain, I think, with dog poop.
Yes,
you know what I'm talking about?
I do.
All right, so explain to us the psychology of this.
Look, I mean, like with the Bogota one, right? Which is the context is it's basically taking your life into your own hands with any traffic related stuff. That was at least the reputation, right? A lot of basically people just everything from jaywalking to like stopping at lights.
It's crazy. It's crazy. It's like bumper cars.
Yeah. And so what do? The traffic police were notoriously corrupt. So like couldn't do that. The new mayor said, well, wait a minute. They took all these out of work mimes and said, well, wait, and used like this idea of like, we so don't want to stand out from our group that they would put them at these locations. And if someone like violated, like even like pulled into the intersection and didn't even, they just walk up and kind of shame them, like didn't say anything. Yeah. And people would be like, oh no,
I don't want that to happen.
No.
Again.
And so it's like, it's like this sort of public shaming was more powerful than paying a fine, right?
Yeah.
And look,
but it's also like the right kind of public shaming.
Yeah,
I think that's probably an important aspect.
I have a personal pet peeve with it all, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah.
That ended well, and that's nice.
Yeah.
But I feel like when you revert to public shaming,
you gotta be careful with how you do it.
Yeah, it's kind of like the whole nudge business where people let's design things to get people to do things that we want them to do, and you're like, or you could teach me why it is that I should make the decision you think I should, and let me make that decision. But so in this case, look, you've got corrupt cops. There's like no way to solve this. And so I feel like, okay, fine. Like, and they did basically get rid of the cops, right?
But you know what to do with humor. And I think that's the dividing line. I mean, you shame people for not wearing a mask at an airport. It just makes me really not want to wear a mask more at an airport, but do with humor.
Yeah. What's funny is about the mask thing, which drove me crazy, which is, I had my personal views and still do. And it was like, you shame people for not wearing a mask. And I'm like, look, but then I would go to other states and you do the exact opposite. Like someone's wearing a mask and people are yelling at them. And I'm like, wait,
you loser.
Yeah. Like, first of all, you have no idea this person might have like chemotherapy or whatever, but you're like, how about we have personal choice? And like,
that was the principle.
Right. So instead it's like, but the thing that I think is the takeaway from these kind of studies is like, again, people really don't want to go against their group. And so you can use these things in pretty powerful ways. In this case, it was reasonably benign in terms of the sort of outcome, but that same mechanism is being weaponized all over the place now. I mean, that is the very heart of cancel culture, right?
That's true.
Like I can't kill you and I can try to take your job, but it's sort of illegal to economically sanction, right? Yeah. So what can I do? I can socially sanction you, right? And it's like, when we keep reverting to that, that's usually a telltale sign that there's something more fundamentally wrong, right? And if we're just going to resort to that shaming, it's not going to end well.
No, and what's interesting about cancel culture is it can only happen on your own side. I think it's hilarious when right-wing influencers are like, oh, I'm being canceled by the left. The left can't cancel you. No. And don't pretend like this isn't good for your career.
No, it's great for your career.
When you get canceled. Like, let's all just be honest about it. Like,
what did Joe Rogan say? He got 2 or 3 million more subscribers?
Of course.
Of course
that's what happens. I just want to be honest. Like, of course it's a real thing, but like, let's just be honest about what the actual dynamics are. It's only your own group.
That's it. And that's why, like, it's interesting on this. I've been on this media tour for the last, couple of months, and everybody is very quick to be like, oh, I can point out the illusions on the other side and I'll name them. And they think that they're doing something honorable. And I'm like, you're not. In fact, you're getting a lot of bonus points from your own group for lobbing those grenades.
You're doing the exact thing that you're
like, let's have the moral courage to stay true to your own principles in the face of what you perceive to be the group being against you.
Yeah. Well, that's for sure true. And I've been kind of on a trend lately of doing that because I just see some things that piss me off and they're worth talking about. And you got to be careful with how you do it. But it's worth pointing out the faults in your own side because I say this all the time. Like the left is easy to beat. I think they've gone down some crazy paths. They're very easy to beat if we just make ourselves worthy of winning. Yeah. Which isn't that hard. Like I'm not saying I have super high standards. I'm just asking for some basic. Let's think critically. Let's be persuasive. Let's rely on first principles, and we will be good.
Yeah. Well, look. I mean, across all our data, so we have private opinion data on both the lives people want to live, the kind of country they want to live in. Like what do they want for the future of America? It is shocking.
Oh yeah, you said that. And I was gonna ask for examples. It's shocking what people agree on. So tell us what that
across
is.
all
Maybe
demographics.
That's a good place to end.
Like it's really like unbelievable. Like so you look at if you just look at say out of 5 dozen attributes you could have of things what a country could be, and we took it from all major political parties around the world. If it was a part of their plank, it could be part of what a country could be, and allow people to do trade-off choices about the priorities for the future of America. What was shocking to me is not just that we had a lot in common, but I will say before we used the private opinion instrument, we took thousands of people and we asked them a question point blank. It was just public opinion. You think we're more divided or united as a country right now? Not surprisingly, 82% said we're more divided. Half of those people said we are extremely divided. What was worse, if you cut it by who you voted for in the last election, a majority of both sides said the other side no longer shares our values for the future of the country.
Right.
And yet you put the same exact people into this private opinion instrument, completely different story. So let me just say, it's not all good news. Like it's not like we definitely disagree fundamentally on some things like immigration. Yeah. There's a political difference that is real and private. Yeah. Okay, good. So fine. That's what democracy's for, right?
Yeah. We're going to argue about
let's argue about that. Yep. What was shocking though is it paled in comparison to the common ground across demographics. So what I think is the most interesting is what it is that we had in common. We care a lot about individual rights. You would not believe it. You know, if you hear the public rhetoric, it would seem like that was going away. It's not true. It is an unbelievably high priority for everybody. In fact, there is no demographic for it's not a top priority.
Yeah.
When you look at what they want, like across all demographics, they want a fair shot, right? They want to be treated equally, right? The dignity as an individual. They know that we owe each other stuff to have a fair shot, like the American dream, things like good healthcare, right? Quality education, these kind of things. And what they don't want, which I think is pretty remarkable, is they don't want a handout. They really don't. The idea of like massive redistribution and a focus on sort of income inequality, it just is a bottom thing for almost everybody, right? And so the problem is that what's I think is also funny is when you ask them about the role of the federal government, everybody agrees they want them out of their lives. That seems to be the common.
That's an interesting one.
It's just like they just, we've got a new instrument we're working on looking at what people want the role of government to be in their lives. Yeah. Where the nooks and crannies, because I think the small government, conservative, big government doesn't work anymore. Right. Obviously.
Well, they don't like if liberals, if people on the left agree with that statement, they want less government in their life, that it's still not enough to get them to vote Republican. No. Maybe they don't think that we really stand for that. I think they've built a kind of a boogeyman representation of us. Right. Maybe because we have some like a couple boogeymen here and there, but so do they. We all do. It's the easiest thing in the world is to like pick out your worst person.
Well, the carnival barkers are always easy to identify. But here's the thing: we want nothing short than the American dream. We really do. This is what people care about. They just don't believe other people care about it. It's a different problem, right? Yeah. It will become self-fulfilling. We will literally destroy ourselves from the inside out. But for me, the opportunity there, knowing what we know about collective illusions, and they're powerful, but they're fragile because they're lies, right? I think there's a moment, just my personal opinion, there is a moment for, I know it's sort of cliche to talk about now, but a Ronald Reagan type, an actual aspirational, because there's two ways you can play this populism, right? You can just get in the mud and throw more mud. Yeah. Or you can paint a picture of a future for the country that is anchored in the honest to God private values and aspirations of a critical mass of the public, right? And you can be confident in those values and the first principles that get you there. And to me, that's what Reagan, he didn't have to, you could be a happy warrior, right? Yeah. You could. Yeah. And he could say, like, we disagree. We just have better ideas. And you get on the business of actually building a more perfect union.
Right. We have better ideas to get to the places we all want to get
to.
to.
And so to me, I look at the private opinion today, I say, look, that path is open, right? Yeah. And
I think people are hungry for it. There's a very exhausted majority of people.
For sure. And I think, not just because we're here, but I really respect the fact that you'll speak your mind and tell people the truth as you understand it. And I think that comes with some arrows your way a lot too. Yeah. But the thing about collective illusions is when they break, they break. And the kind of change that happens is like exponential, right? Because it's this bandwagon, like I'm not convincing you to change your mind. I'm convincing you that actually your group agrees with you. Yeah. And that you should be more vocal and you should not just hope for something better, but expect it.
Right. Well, that's a good optimistic place to be and end on. Todd, thanks so much for being on. Thanks for writing this book. And I look forward to seeing a lot more of that research that you talked about. That'll be helpful and insightful.
We'll send it your way.
I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.